to say.
Go ahead.
No, I just the king doesn't have to say much. He just says, hang him on that. He can go that. Well, they just talked about that.
Well, it's good to be king. I mean, you just give orders and people figure out what to do.
It doesn't make sense to me, though.
Which part doesn't make sense?
Well, why he got so angry, but this guy is his number one guy. He knows this guy. So why would he, he'd have to have second thoughts like, hey, this is the number one guy. I mean.
Well,
Yeah, I know it makes the story go better this way.
it's in the script. I mean, there is that.
Different writer, he just.
But that being said, here that's how it is. What does that say about the portrayal of the king? He's easily swayed, manipulated. I mean, that's been obvious all the way through. That he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. Just clearly, he's not.
How did he get to be king?
It was born into it. At some point there was a struggle for succession, but it wasn't this king. It was a couple of generations earlier in the Persian Empire. So this is not someone who's kind of, earned his spurs in battle or anything like that. In the palace his whole life, groomed and trained for this, knowing from early on this is who he was and what he was going to be. So, what does it take for a fish to discover the water? I mean, when you are always immersed in something, you don't even notice it. So what does it say about this powerful man who clearly is not particularly qualified, but that's sort of beside the point. If the story were to continue, it does not, it doesn't bode well for Mordecai in the long run. I mean, this guy will turn on you
Oh, yeah.
in a heartbeat. I would, I'd rather be his enemy, I think, than his friend if I had to choose. So it's not a very flattering portrayal. I mean, really, in Esther in particular, powerful men are not portrayed in any kind of flattering way. They're all sort of dumb and arrogant and privileged and unthinking. Mordecai is the closest one to an intelligent male in this book, and he's a Jew. So what's the agenda? What's the point? So just from kind of normal human expectations, no, it doesn't make any sense. So then I think we're invited to ask, okay, who is the audience? What's going on? Why does this make sense to someone who reads it? So hang on to those questions, because that's what it prompts us, I think, to think about. What are the underlying points here? Because it's sort of a burlesque in some ways, I mean, this is, we don't expect Abbott and Costello to make all kinds of sense either. But it's also not pointless with a little bit of thought. So that's a great place to start, actually, in that kind of thinking. So let's pick it up here with chapter 8 and go a little ways in, and then we'll talk some more about details and then broader issues. So chapter 8, verse 1. We're still on the same day when Haman gets hoist on his own pole, so to speak. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming on my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So let's stop there and talk a bit about details and see what questions or thoughts that you have through verse 8 there.
I like the way she threw her tantrum and then asked for reason. Well, weeping and wailing and what all.
She's really good, isn't she?
Yeah, she is.
You have kindergarten too.
Yeah.
She understands how to make the system work. Huh? Because on the one hand, I mean, this is very sort of, self-abasing kind of behavior. I mean, just think of the whole series of ifs that are in verse 5 there. If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and if I have his approval, the deference is 4 layers deep. Huh?
Seems like it's
So, she knows how to butter the bread, right? To make things happen. I mean, by that time, she has massaged that stupid king's ego enough to get what she wants. She's good at knowing which levers to pull and which buttons to push.
But think how much she and Mordecai had to think, because they had already figured out he was easily manipulated. So nobody else, I mean, your normal person would not have 4 layers. I mean, she really wheeled him in.
Yeah, it was laid on pretty thick. But apparently that's what it took. Here she is, she's the queen, she is deposed Haman. Still, she comes weeping, she waits for the king to turn his scepter. She, if it please the king, this is how it's done. And Carol, part of your point is about, the strategic thinking that goes into this whole process, that on the very day when Haman is deposed, they are prepared with then the rest of the strategy. This was not, done on the fly, I don't think.
No, how many layers did they have that they already did to get him out of there?
Yeah. So these are very smart people. Which, when you are someone who does not have power, that's what you have to do. You have to be smarter than the system. Yeah, Al.
Do you think the king was exasperated with her? You know, first I gave you this guy, killed him. I put him on the stake. You know, I made your dad the thing, and now here you come back another day and you're weeping and crying again. I'm going, oh my God, what do I have to do to get this woman off my back?
No.
You know? And he says, oh well, if that's all it is, just have your father write an edict, you know, and
Why did you
you know,
please?
Leave me alone.
leave me alone. Let me get to the other stuff.
Just go and do it. Exasperated.
I don't know if that would be it. He might not have
Possibly. I mean,
been.
who knows?
It's as likely as anything else.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to just kind of keep in the back of our minds just sort of the general assumptions in much of the world, and in the ancient world certainly, about when and how it's appropriate for men and women to speak. We saw some of this in Ruth, for example. Boaz is a man. He gets to speak in public. He gets to address the elders at the gates and all of that. Men get to speak in public about weighty matters and make decisions. Women do not, generally. Doesn't mean women don't get to speak. It means that the place where women use their voices are generally indoors, in private, in the house, not out at the gate. And so it is this sort of, capital offense almost for anyone to approach the king sort of uninvited. I mean, that was made clear earlier in the book. And then for a woman to exercise this sort of public negotiation, this is not probably in the royal bedroom that this conversation happened. He has his scepter. This is when he's sitting on the throne holding court, which is always in front of, dozens of retainers and helpers and all that, some of whom, clearly there are factions, there's competition. There's all kinds of stuff going on in the background in this royal court. We've seen that throughout Esther. So she challenges some of these expectations as well, to simply be a woman who speaks up to power in a public forum. That's not typical for any woman in the ancient world. And remember that Esther is disadvantaged, in a variety of ways. She's an orphan, she's a Jew, she's a woman. She's on the outside. So she has all of these sort of handicaps of honor.
But do you think he was still taken by her? Because if he didn't like her, he could just said, bring me more and I'll pick another queen. He gave up his best friend for her.
Isn't it interesting? Apparently this king liked to be pursued. Mm-hmm. Because what opens the door, you may recall, Ruth, what opens the door to all this is when she wants to come and see him. It's been more than 30 days. Well, I doubt if the king had taken vows of abstinence during those 30 days. She asks to see him, and that's what kind of gets things rolling. So, is he still taken with her? Yeah, I think so. I think he's taken more with the idea that she's taken with him. There's nothing that makes someone else more attractive than when we think they like us.
Well, she was pretty smart. She knew that all the ifs, all those layers would save his face.
Oh, yes.
When he saved the Jews, because that was the big thing in the other chapters.
Yep.
Where the Jews were going to be wiped out by Haman.
So this business of saving face, of maintaining public honor, is everything in ancient Mediterranean society. Wars are fought over this kind of thing. And so, Carol, you're absolutely right. It's beautifully constructed, this request, and it strikes just the right tone. And to come back to Al's wondering about, was he exasperated? I think that she was clear about just how far she could go and how to get there. And if it had been a little further, it might have been too much. But she got to where she needed to go, and she knew how to get there, and has a happy ending for the Jews.
I think he's also a guy that doesn't like to see women cry. Because he doesn't really.
There aren't so many of us who do.
I guess not. They're there.
I mean, that's the truth.
But if he's that powerful, he really don't care.
It's human.
He doesn't have to care.
He doesn't have to.
That's true.
He doesn't care.
But he does respond.
Right.
Oh, he does respond. Connie, you were going to say something a minute
Well,
ago.
look how she compromised herself.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
It's an interesting study of this character. To begin with, think about how this happens with Esther. To begin with, Mordecai puts her in a place of influence, but, it costs her.
Price.
Yep. Basically, he traffics her. And then after that, when she's selected, then she moves from, the harem of the virgins to the harem of the concubines, and is sort of, she's used property at that point, not new. But that puts her in a place to be able to save her people. I mean, this is kind of that punchline in chapter 4. Who knows? Maybe you were put in this place for just such a time as this. But I think you're right, Connie, that the kind of self-abasement is not over at that point, by any means. So she is the one who, once again, risks her life and safety by approaching the king with no guarantees, not knowing if... the king rolled over on Haman so easily that it's hard to believe, really. But there it is in the book. There's no reason to think that she would have known that in advance. And she says quite clearly, if it costs me my life, it costs me my life. She says that. Then here she is again, not only on her knees, but probably down on her face, weeping. Well, she's the queen. But there she is. So, in light of that, how do you... go ahead, Al. I'll remember my question. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, you think it's Valentine's Day when she did this?
The irony... The irony was not lost on me. that we were reading this Old Testament soap opera on Valentine's Day here.
Look at today's world with this, and think of the CIAs and the spies that, the Russian spy that came over and made out with government officials, or some of the silly TV shows that we watch where there's always people going, and trying to seduce other people.
But money and sex get you a long ways.
Yeah, it does.
I don't, what's the latest thing that's come out that, some guy who's cooperated with, with the Iranians, and,
I know.
it guarantee is for money and sex or both. It's not going to be because of some allegiance to the Iranian regime. It's going to be because of leverage or desire.
I just finished reading the book for our book club, the Alice something, I can't remember, and women spies World War One and that. I'm having a hard time. It's fiction, but based on real facts. I mean,
Well, I mean, the Mata Hari,
uh-huh.
which is sort of this, trope in the movies and that kind of thing, that was based on a real person. I mean, this using particularly female sexuality as a tool and a weapon. I mean, as an offensive weapon. There's nothing old or new about it.
I'm having a hard time separating what I read in that book from what's happening supposedly in the news. I mean, I just kind of go back.
Yeah, on the one hand, I mean, this is such a different culture, and on the other hand, it's still human beings, who even in this very different cultural setting are not so different, and are motivated by many of the same things. I want to come back to your line of question, Connie. Look, what did she give up? What did it cost her? And to follow up on that, as you think about what she did to accomplish the goals, what do you think of Esther?
She was an orphan, and this guy took her in, so she owed him that he was the only one she could talk to. And then he just kept feeding her, and you do this and you do that, and she was a Jew, and she wanted to do too what was best for the Jews, but he was her mentor all the way when he adopted her and brought her to this place.
She's a survivor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. She's a survivor. She does what she has to do
Mm-hmm.
to survive in this culture.
Well, and not only did she save the Jews, we don't hear anymore about, like, Vasti, any of the other concubines getting exploited like Vasti did. Did she save the women in his harem or whatever?
Did she change the system?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah.
Did you get about the compromises? Did you have, I thought you had asked a question about that. I was wondering what-
Yeah.
The pastor asked
Compromised
that.
herself, yeah.
Well, is that a... Yeah, I think that's one of the questions in the book. There are several kind of capital T, capital Q, the questions, but this is one that's really interesting, I think. And we ultimately, I think it's really helpful to read Esther closely like this from within the context of the story. I think that's really critical so we don't sort of just make it up as we go along. I mean, it deserves to be treated as it is. And then at some point, we have the opportunity to read it as well from the perspective of being followers of Jesus. And by that I mean, one of the ways that the New Testament sees Jesus, for example, in Philippians 2, is as one who is humiliated and remains obedient even to the point of death on a cross. And as a result of that, God has raised his name above every name and exalted him so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and every tongue should confess. I mean, it's Philippians 2, 5 through 11. It's the Christ hymn. We keep saying quite rightly that Esther saves her people. That's right. When Christians use that word save, some bells should go off. Because there's someone that we call Savior. Is Esther, in her compromises or losses or sacrifices, does she look at all like Jesus? That is not a question that Jewish readers would bring to the book of Esther, nor should they. They're not obliged to do that. It is a question that we can bring, though. So, Connie, you described her as a survivor.
Yeah.
That's a lens to look at her through, particularly as, you look at Esther as, this woman in a very male-dominant system who uses that system against itself in very intelligent and strategic ways to accomplish what needs to be done. I think that's right. There are things to learn from that perspective. Does she initially, Ruth, you're quite right, she doesn't sign up to go in. No, she is coached into it by Mordecai.
Right, but then when they put her in these harems, she had no choice. Bring them all to me,
But there comes a point in chapter 4 where that really flips, and Esther starts giving orders.
Does she now evolve into she does what she has to do to survive, but now does she evolve into, now she's the savior of these Jews?
She's the only character in the book who grows.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's the only one. If anything, the king and Haman obviously diminish. Mordecai, through the middle of the book, steps into the background, and it's Esther who drives the action. Now, it's going to be interesting here at the end. Esther sort of disappears again into the background, and Mordecai steps to the fore again. That's interesting to look at as well. What does that mean?
Well, maybe her
He used her.
task is
She's done. She is, Mordecai says, maybe, who knows, maybe it was for just such a time as this that you were put in this place. Here it is. Mission accomplished. Yeah, Al.
Oh, I've got a problem there. You see, I didn't understand Connie's response about that she was compromised. I don't understand compromise.
Oh, say some more, Connie.
that's a man's view. It really is.
I don't see where she was compromised.
These are all her principles
I don't understand
on her.
understand the word compromise.
Just as honest.
Well, just take him point by point. I mean, what do you see that happened to her?
That wouldn't have happened anyway. She is the consort to the king. She does his beck and call. Okay, so
You don't think that's a compromise?
I know, I agree that's a compromise, but
Okay.
how does that increase the compromise that she's going through? She's got no choice. I mean, if she's going to survive, that's
She's got no choice but to compromise herself, yes.
right.
Yeah.
But
She goes
but it doesn't
before the
increase
king, weeping on the ground, begging, promising who knows what.
Maybe some of it is on the one hand, to enter into a compromise is to choose to give up something to get something. That's one meaning of it. To be compromised has more the sense of to be violated. So maybe some of it is in those two different meanings.
But she's already in that relationship, regardless. Before, she was still in that relationship. So she's not gonna be any more compromised after she went.
No. I think it may be that in physical terms, at least, that's true. But I think that the book is at pains to portray her as taking additional risks with her person that she would not have had to.
Oh, you're right.
And that some of those risks, it's one thing to approach the king, even though the law says you can't do that, and if the king doesn't like it, you can die. Okay, so there's that. I don't think it's a stretch to think that if you are the queen approaching the king, who hasn't been very interested in you for a while, that there are going to be certain expectations that you are going to, you're not only going to produce a request, you're going to produce sex as well.
Right.
Well, so I think from Connie's perspective, that would be having sex to get something rather than as an expression of care, I think women would describe as compromising yourself.
But that's also a tool she's using to obtain power.
Yeah, no doubt, yeah.
So is it
It's
a
only a tool
compromise
she
if
has.
is it a compromise that she's using it for power?
Do the men in the story have to prostitute themselves in order to?
No.
Okay. Okay.
No.
That's the point, huh?
She's just using her body to get what she wants.
Which is one of
It's
the.
a compromise.
Hang in there.
I mean, it is.
I
It's.
just think it's a difference in a man's perspective. I do. I don't know
Okay.
that my husband would feel any different than what you do. It's just a difference in a
I think that's
How you
a
view
big
it.
part
A
of it.
man's
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. Different set of lenses. And generally, by and large, we privileged white males, for example, we don't have to do that kind of thing.
Well, Haman had to pay 60 something to get his degree.
Yeah, he just paid the
That
bill.
was his compromise.
He just paid the bill.
Yeah.
She
She didn't have any money.
no.
and that's the difference. Mm. Yeah. To spend money is one thing. To feel violated and penetrated in order to accomplish what you need to get, that's another thing. But I think, Connie, you're right that this is not part of what it means to be a male. I don't want to chase this rabbit too far down the trail, but it is kind of germane to the topic. In the ancient world, gender is as much positional as it is biological. Now, I'm going to explain that, but that's just sort of the basic statement. For us in the West, we think of gender as almost exclusively biological. It's a function of whatever equipment you got. But in the ancient world, men penetrate and women are penetrated. And so one of the ways to shame your enemy, if you win a battle, for example, is to turn your enemy into a woman. And the way that you do that is you rape your enemy. Men penetrate, women are penetrated. I'm not sure that we've gotten so far from that. I think that is I think that is a part of kind of the human construction of sexuality. And it is why up to the current time, it is why male on male rape is still a tool of war, even in the 21st century in some settings. And it is why male on male rape in prisons is an expression of power, not desire. You turn some other man into a woman, and you call him a bitch. That's what that all means. And in the ancient world in particular, women by definition have more shame than men do. That's just a social given. Are of lower status because they are penetrated. They don't do the penetrating. And so then it's necessary for women to use other means. Sometimes to use sexuality as an offensive tool. We see that in Esther. When we read Judith and Holofernes, we'll see it that's, when we get to Judith, the fact that she kills Holofernes with his own sword is not merely, don't miss the symbolism. Don't let that get past you. We'll come back to that. But Esther uses her sexuality as a tool. Al, your point, I think, is she does it willingly. Well, yeah, willingly because she has no other choice. She has no other tool available to her. That doesn't mean it doesn't cost her. And I think that's the distance to be bridged. Willingly, yes. At what cost to herself and to her sense of self and to her, who and what will she be when this is all done? How's she going to feel about herself when she's 72 and looking back at life? And, yes, Savior of the Jews. And what did that cost her? I think that's part of what you're thinking about, huh, Connie? Yeah. Yep.
When she writes her final, I did what I had to do.
And did it hollow her out? Did it empty her out? Which sometimes happens.
And another comment you brought up was, did we see Jesus in all of this?
Yeah.
Last night, one of the Bible verses we had was John 14:15 through 18. And, Jesus is talking about God is in him and he will be in his disciples. And, even last night I'm like, I never really thought about I and him or him and me or, so I'm not sure people back then even saw God in themselves.
Well, for Jesus and John, that is one of John's ways of reflecting on the mystery of the Trinity, that God is, in fact, in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. I think, when I think about Esther, I think about the next chapter of John, though, in John 15. Greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. This is how Jesus describes the nature of love. in the Christian community, to the willingness to lay down one's life for the community. I mean, it seems to me that is that's a brief and accurate description of what Esther has done. Not that she was executed, but she makes it clear, if it costs me my life, it costs me my life, but this is what has to be done. You know, and I don't think that came easily to her, if we're thinking with her as a character, any more than Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane prays, you know, if this cup could pass from me, that please, but in the end, not my will, but yours. There are these sort of Jesus vibrations that I think we can feel in Esther. I would not suggest for a minute that this was written as prophecy of the Messiah or anything like that. I wouldn't suggest that for a minute. But we can look back through Jesus to see what love looks like, what sacrificial love looks like, and as you point out, Connie, what it can cost. And hooray, she succeeded. Yes, I mean, absolutely. None of the 70,000 Jews in the empire were going to complain about that. But did they even know what? Did they even know what it took for them to have their lives? What it cost her? Probably not. Wouldn't think so. Yeah, I doubt if any of this got put into the paper, you know. So I think that is that's a useful lens through which to look at Esther a bit, at her sacrifice. Okay, let's go on a little further here. And so a lot of this is sort of administrative detail here. Chapter 8, verse 9, the king's secretaries were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews and to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. He wrote letters in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers riding on fast steeds bred from the royal herd. By these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, with their children and women, and to plunder their goods on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all the peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift royal steeds, hurried out, urged by the king's command. The decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. What do you make of that? Is that what you expected?
Do we know how many Jews have been killed up to this point?
The decree that was issued specified that this genocide was going to happen on that one day previously. So the decree itself is simply turned 180 degrees. It isn't all the Jews who are going to be wiped out, but now it's all the enemies of the Jews who are going to be wiped out. Still on the one day. And all their goods plundered.
Did they just pick a day, or was that a special day?
If we go back into the beginning of Esther, you may recall that Haman drew lots to settle on the day, and that's why the festival is called Purim, because the word for lot is a pur, and lots is the plural, Purim. So that's how the day was established, was by chance. Which in Esther, and this is something that we'll want to discuss at length, I think. There's no chance in Esther, by the way. Not really. That's one of the intentions of the book, I think, is that what seems like accidents are not really. But here we have, I would have expected the edict to say the Jews have permission to defend themselves.
Went a lot further.
What's described is an offensive elimination of their enemies.
Yeah.
Taking revenge is the word that's used. The word in Hebrew for enemy can mean oppressor, adversary, source of distress. It's not a neutral word. It really means someone who's coming after you. In verse 11, how many verbs do you need to describe what they're supposed to do? Huh? Destroy, kill, annihilate,
Get out.
attack.
Exactly. Plunder.
Obliterate.
Gee.
No doubt is left, is there? Yeah, Al.
That's because the Macedonians were trying to take over the Persian rule from the Persians.
In your study Bible, it says that.
That's what it says that's basically what it says in the letter. And that's disrupting the Persians' life of peace among all the different groups that the Persians have captured.
So those scholars are suggesting that this is
Peace in the empire if you get rid of the...
So this is part of a kind of an internal power struggle that's going on. I mean, that may well be.
Yeah. Well, it says the letter that was published by this guy, Mordecai.
Oh, yeah.
It says how it was going. It's a page and a half.
That's in the Greek editions.
Yeah, that's an addition.
Right,
That's an addition to this chapter.
Yeah.
It fits right in the middle of this, between your verses.
Yeah. So that's a great. We're not going to read that whole letter because it does go on for a while.
It goes on and on.
But clearly, the first readers of Esther have the same confusion we do. What in the world's going on here? And so some enterprising scribe decides to insert this letter from Mordecai that explains what's going
Yeah,
on.
they went to all the provinces.
Right. Yeah, because the letter is only mentioned here, but in the edition we get the letter. And it's this, I had forgotten that. It is this internal power struggle, and Mordecai ends up on the right side of things,
That's right.
and the Jews are on the right
Jews are
side.
on the right side now.
Now they are.
And, that makes some sense in terms of the plot. And it also makes some sense in terms of the reversal. I mean, is Haman then really identified as on the other side, working inside the palace to overthrow the king? And this is a general sort of house cleaning from top to bottom now. But it's not in the original. So So it sort of cleans up the tension, is what it does. It says, yeah, well, really, the Jews can't be bad guys here.
No. Well, it also explains why they killed them all and took all their stuff, because these guys are trying to overthrow the king, and we're trying to set it right for the king. Being good, loyal Jews.
Again, the brave and compromise.
Yeah.
Did only Jews knew this date?
No, it was published throughout the empire,
Okay.
so that it's coming. Before all of this happens, this date has been published in all 127 provinces and what's supposed to happen. That had all gone out. And in the original, we could imagine perhaps that people had started to take advantage of that in advance. If y'all would move on and sell off your property at 10 cents on the dollar and just vacate your houses, and then you'd live longer. So we can imagine in the background that kind of thing might have been going on, and that makes some sense of revenge and enemies and plunder, getting back what belonged to them that they parted with under duress. I think that's one possible scenario to describe what's in the original book, is that this is trying to bring things back to zero again, not to take anything from somebody else. It also reflects what's called the theology of holy war, which you can find at several places in the Old Testament. And that theology of holy war suggests that when you destroy God's enemies, then you take all their property and offer that to God as a sacrifice as well. That's the theology of holy war. Many scholars think that that's reflected in this text as well, that this is what good Jews have always done when threatened, is engage in holy war at God's direction, and whatever plunder is secured then is offered to God. As a matter of fact, earlier in the Old Testament, it's a sin to keep any of that for yourself because it's dedicated to God. So that may be reflected here as well. But none of that is said with any clarity. It certainly is not said explicitly, which again is why the editors of the editions feel the need to make it crystal clear, that the Jews are on the, to coin a phrase, on the side of the angels, and that's why it turned out the way it did. I mean, that is one of the functions of those additions to Esther is to clean up the messiness of the story, and also to make sure that God gets mentioned. Because nowhere in the original is God mentioned, ever.
If you knew that somebody was going to come through and destroy you on the 13th of the month of Adar, wouldn't you take action to kind of protect yourself? And did these people do it, or they just sit back and say, okay, here I am, cut off my head?
Well, that's a really good question. People would take action, I think. But what kind of action? Well, and I mean, what's possible if you are, it's a story directed to people in these kind of marginal situations, I think.
Well, this is kind of jumping ahead, but I think the funniest line here is that the last one in chapter 8, where they claim to be Jews. Suddenly, all the people claim to be Jews.
Right, it's cool. It's cool to be Jew. It's cool to be a Jew.
Good to be a Jew.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, then you're not going to get wiped out if you're a
There
Jew.
you go, I would change too, maybe.
Well, I
Compromise.
That's their defense.
I think about, this is sort of what's called intertextuality. I think about the situation of the Russian Jews in Fiddler on the Roof. They are told that this is coming. There's going to be a pogrom. There's going to be this persecution. If they stay, they will lose everything and die. If they fight, they will lose everything and die, because the Russians have all the guns. So what do? Their neighbors offer them 5 or 10 cents on the dollar, and for what they can't move, and then they pick up and they move. And that is probably more descriptive of the situation of Jews in the midst of these other cultures. The book of Esther, I think, is some measure of wishful thinking in that regard. It depends, some of how we read it depends on when we think it was written and under what circumstances as well. It may well have been written about the time when there actually was a Jewish nation. In the mid 2nd century BC, in 165 or so, the Greeks, who were the Hellenistic Empire that was in charge of that part of the country, the Jews defeated them and reestablished what they thought looked like the kingdom of David from about 165 to, until 67 BC, when the Romans took over. So there's about 100 years in there of what's called the Hasmonean period. This is when when 1st and 2nd Maccabees are written, for example, if you look in the Apocrypha. So there's a stretch where there actually is, once again, a Jewish kingdom, this Hasmonean kingdom. And scholars speculate that the book of Esther, with its kind of, saber-rattling patriotism, that the book of Esther makes sense in that context. The Jews are defeated, along with everybody else, by the Romans, and they become a subject people. And the last thing that you want at that point is this book that portrays us as rebellious, violent people. You don't want that kind of thing floating around. It's better to kind of tune it up a little bit with these additions so that we look like we were on the side of the empire. So that the additions make more sense after the end of the Hasmonean Empire, or at least, looking toward that happening, because the additions really make the Jews look like loyal citizens of the empire. That's the function of this letter. We were on the king's side, after all. That's why we did these things. Yeah. So how you read it depends somewhat on where it's set in history and who's being addressed. But I think that makes the most sense, that this sort of militant and even militaristic perspective is probably early in the Hasmonean period, when it made sense for Jews to look at themselves and say, in fact, we can be powerful militarily. We have our own kingdom. And that the additions make more sense when either they've been absorbed into the empire or that's on the horizon. They may have seen the Romans coming and decided, we better amend our documents a little bit so that when the Romans take over, they don't see us as much of a threat. So again, we read the story, but then we also have to try and read who was reading the story in order to come to a fuller understanding. So this makes sense, this kind of holy war, everybody wanting to be a Jew, that makes sense in the context of that Hasmonean kingdom. So let's just finish that paragraph here, because that is one of the real punchlines. Then Mordecai, verse 15, went out from the presence of the king wearing royal robes of blue and white with great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple, while the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Hey, that's quite an accomplishment for Mordecai here, huh? For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor in every province and in every city. Wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Furthermore, many of the peoples of the country professed to be Jews because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Yeah, that doesn't seem particularly credible, but there it is.
Eat 'em, join 'em.
Yeah, well, again.
Senator says she's not Indian now.
Yeah,
He knows her.
the wind blows from the east, the wind blows from the west.
I heard the funniest line about that. And I don't want to get into politics, but someone.
We're reading Esther, we're in politics.
I can't remember who it was, one of the late night hosts, and I don't watch it, but I heard it. He said, well, if she was elected president, that would give a whole new meaning to commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
Yikes.
I hadn't heard that.
I just heard it repeated on the radio. I didn't see it.
You lost control.
Yeah, you know what they say. Dying is easy, it's humor that's hard, Oh my goodness. Well, on the other hand, I mean, is that last line of chapter 8, is it intended to be sort of this serious report, or is it kind of tongue in cheek? Because it is funny. Yeah. And we don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, is Esther supposed to be more historical fiction, or is it more Three Stooges? I mean, and we don't know for sure, but there are some things that are pretty funny. Yeah.
Well, part of the story has to be true, otherwise they wouldn't have the festival.
It is written to justify, to underwrite the festival of Purim. Absolutely.
I mean, so
There it is, right there. Everybody's ready to have a party.
True. The story might be wrong, or not exactly right, but
But somewhere, something,
there's some truth
Facts.
in the fiction.
and that festival it's not a new invention. It goes back millennia. So yes, is it this as we read it? No, probably not. Is there something like this? Is there some experience of reversal? Well, I mean, the same as with the story of Hanukkah in the book of Maccabees. That the lamp didn't go out for 8 days in the temple, and I mean, most Jewish readers say, well, I don't. Did that happen or not? I don't know. But by golly, we threw the Greeks out.
Mhm.
Regardless of how it worked. So yes, there is something that led to that festival, which is now celebrated, and the goal is to drink enough that you can't tell the difference between Mordecai is blessed and Haman be cursed. It's just parenthetically, the Temple Israel, the folks over at the Tri-Faith Center, the synagogue, I follow them on Facebook, and they've been advertising their adults only Purim festival.
That's what I did. That's fine.
And,
Okay.
and I did send a little note wondering if a bunch of Lutherans who had read the book of Esther could come, and they haven't replied yet. So I don't.
Gee,
It may be a private affair. I said we'd be willing to contribute to the, but I don't know if they're going to go for that. But so yeah, how would folks at Emmanuel respond if we had some adult only festivals here at Emmanuel? I mean, attendance might go up.
wish I could take by you, Pastor.
I looked at that and I thought, we can't get away with that. Crap.
I thought it was odd, but I didn't go any further.
Well, I mean, it's because it's perfectly responsible. I mean, if you're going to drink until you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordecai, you got to leave the kids home. I mean, it's as simple as that. And make sure there's a designated driver, of course. So. Well, no, we should. Let's see. Is there anything else that I can cover? Let's see, ready for revenge. No, that's as far as we'll go this time. We talked a little bit about Holy War. Next time, we'll work our way through most of chapter 9. And there's hardly anything of chapter 10, of course. And the details at the end here, there are a few things that are interesting, but what I'd like you to think about in advance for, at least for next time, is what does it mean? What's being said that all of these things happen, but God is not mentioned? I mean, how does God's will or plan or desire or whatever words you want to use, what's the perspective, do you think, of the book of Esther on God's involvement in this? And not the perspective of the editions, because that's clear. You know, the editions couldn't tolerate the divine anonymity in the original book. They couldn't allow that to happen. So in the editions, God is mentioned, I don't know, 24 times or something like that.
At least 3 times in the letter.
Yeah, I think if you add them all up, it's 24 times or something like that. And it's 0 in the original.